Europe's largest land animal should not exist, by two completely separate standards, and for most of the last century almost nobody realized either one. Everyone assumed the European bison was simply a slightly different cousin of the American bison, a large grazing animal that had always looked and bred true the way any ordinary species does, descended cleanly from a single ancestral line the same way most mammals are. Genetic testing eventually proved that assumption wrong on a level nobody expected going in. And decades before the DNA even entered the picture, the species had already come close enough to total extinction that its survival alone defies the basic math of how small populations are supposed to recover or fail to. Start with what a European bison, also called a Wisent, actually is. Slightly smaller than its American cousin but built for dense forest rather than open plains, with longer legs, a smaller head, and a less pronounced shoulder hump suited to weaving through trees, rather than sprinting across open grassland. The Wisent once ranged across most of the European continent, from France in the west, through Poland, and into the Caucasus Mountains in the east, appearing in prehistoric cave paintings alongside mammoths and woolly rhinos as one of the most commonly depicted animals of the entire Ice Age. Centuries of sustained hunting steadily shrank that enormous range down to just two isolated pockets by the start of the 20th century, one in Poland's Bialowieza forest and another far to the east in the Caucasus, populations that had once been part of a single, continuous range now cut off from each other entirely, with no realistic way for animals from one group to ever reach the other again. World War I finished off the first population almost entirely. Occupying soldiers, reportedly told directly by a scientist that the animals were exceedingly rare and worth protecting, shot them anyway, first for meat and later simply because they happened to be there, leaving only a small handful alive in Bialowieza by the war's end. The second population held on for less than another decade. The last confirmed wild European bison anywhere on Earth was killed by poachers in the Caucasus in 1927. When the shooting finally stopped, the entire global population of the species stood at 54 animals, scattered across a handful of European zoos, every single one of them descended from just 12 founding individuals, 11 from the Bialowieza lineage, and one lone survivor from the Caucasus. In 1922, scientists from Poland, Germany, Britain, and Sweden formed the Society for the Protection of the European Bison, specifically to coordinate what remained of the species across those scattered zoo populations, treating international cooperation as the only realistic path back from a number that low. If you're finding this interesting, be sure to subscribe to understand more DNA from the past. That bottleneck alone should have been enough to finish the species off for good. A population this small, rebuilt entirely from 12 founders, typically carries so little genetic diversity that inbreeding depression, reduced fertility, weakened immune function, and a rising rate of harmful mutations, expressed openly in every generation, becomes almost impossible to avoid over time. Conservationists split the surviving lineage into two carefully managed lines, one drawing purely from the Bialowieza founders, and a second mixing in the single surviving Caucasus animal alongside the Bialowieza stock, and spent decades slowly rebuilding numbers inside zoo enclosures across multiple countries, before attempting anything more ambitious than careful, monitored breeding between distantly related individuals. In 1952, 25 years after the last wild individual had been shot, two bulls were released back into Bialowieza forest, with several cows following shortly after them. What happened next defied the odds that severe a genetic bottleneck usually guarantees for a species this size. The population didn't just survive the reintroduction. It grew steadily, decade after decade, eventually passing several thousand animals across Poland, Belarus, and a growing list of reintroduction sites throughout Europe, with more than 2,000 of those animals now living entirely free-ranging rather than confined to managed reserves. An outcome population geneticists don't generally expect from 12 founders, no matter how carefully the subsequent breeding is managed and monitored across multiple countries and generations. That survival story turned out to be only half of what made the species so improbable. The deeper surprise was sitting quietly in its DNA the entire time, waiting for anyone with the right tools to actually look. For as long as European bison had been formally studied, scientists treated it as a straightforward member of the bison family, related to the American bison and to an earlier, now extinct steppe bison that once roamed across the whole of Eurasia, differing only in the ordinary, expected way any two related species differ from a shared ancestor over time. In 2016, a research team led by geneticist Julien Soubrière sequenced ancient DNA from a series of European bison specimens, some tens of thousands of years old and recovered from sites across the continent, and published the results in the journal Nature Communications, testing that simple family tree assumption directly and rigorously for the first time, using tools that simply hadn't existed when the species was first formally classified. The result didn't just complicate the picture slightly, it rewrote what kind of animal the European bison actually is at its core. The species turned out to be a genuine hybrid, formed when steppe bison interbred with aurochs, the extinct wild ancestor of modern domestic cattle, more than 120,000 years ago, producing a new, stable lineage carrying roughly 10% Aurochs ancestry alongside the majority steppe bison heritage that made up the rest of its genome. Subscribe to not miss the next one. That result should not have been possible under the ordinary rules of mammal reproduction, and that is exactly what makes it so significant to researchers studying hybridization more broadly. Steppe bison and aurochs don't just belong to different species. They belong to entirely different genera, bison and bos, separate branches of the cattle family separated by millions of years of independent evolution, the kind of genetic distance that typically makes successful fertile hybridization between two mammal lineages either completely impossible or so rare that it produces sterile, one-off offspring incapable of founding any kind of lasting population of their own. Most attempts at cross-genus hybridization in mammals end exactly that way. A genetic dead end rather than a new beginning, which is part of why nobody had seriously considered the possibility for a species already assumed to have a simple, ordinary family tree. The European bison did something considerably more improbable than that. It became a stable, self-sustaining, freely breeding lineage in its own right, successful enough to spread across an entire continent and survive for well over 100,000 years afterward, long enough to leave its own extensive fossil and cave art record scattered across multiple countries. Researchers cross-checked the genetic timeline against an unusual second, independent source of evidence: prehistoric cave paintings scattered across sites in France and Spain, which depict two visibly different bison body types appearing at different points in time, one more closely resembling a steppe bison, and a later one showing the distinct proportions of the modern Wisent. A pattern that lines up strikingly well with the exact genetic shift the ancient DNA identified, giving the hybridization story physical, visual confirmation dating back tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to actually test it with a genome sequencer. Line up both halves of what the European bison's genetics actually revealed, and the species becomes considerably harder to explain than the ordinary bison relative everyone assumed it was for so long, before anyone had the tools to look closely enough to question it. It was never simply a European version of the same animal roaming the American plains, related through nothing more than an ordinary evolutionary split from a shared ancestor millions of years back. It was the product of two separate genera crossing paths, in a way biology doesn't usually allow to succeed at all, producing a hybrid stable enough to outlast both of its extinct parent species, the aurochs and the steppe bison, by tens of thousands of years, long after the two lineages that created it had already vanished from the planet entirely, leaving their improbable offspring standing alone. And when hunting finally pushed that same improbable lineage down to 12 founding animals scattered across a handful of zoos in the 1920s, the kind of bottleneck that ends most species for good within a few generations of inbreeding, it recovered anyway, Rebuilding itself into thousands of animals roaming free across the same continent it had already defied the odds to survive on once before, tens of thousands of years earlier during the depths of the Ice Age. Europe's largest land animal was never the straightforward single origin species it looked like from the outside for as long as anyone studied it using bones and behavior alone, without the genetic tools needed to see the truth underneath. It was an improbable hybrid that shouldn't have taken hold in the first place, nearly erased down to a dozen animals scattered across a handful of zoos a century ago, and still walking through Bialowieza forest today, regardless of every reason biology gives for why it shouldn't be there at all.